Pythagoreans I want to talk about is Archytas. Archytas was a friend of Plato's. He was also from Tarentum. As I mentioned before, he was a statesman, an archon, a leader of Tarentum for some time. He was an accomplished mathematician and philosopher of science. He seems to have sort of laid the groundwork for the philosophy of science, you might say, that we find in Aristotle and in Plato. He really explored the question, like, what is knowledge? How do we find things out about the physical world, right? So the Pythagoreans before him had used mathematics to explain all of these physical phenomenon in harmonics, and he agrees with them. He thinks that this is real knowledge, that we're really learning something about the underlying structure. But what does that mean? What does it mean that our knowledge is capable of progressing in its grasp of the physical world? So he kind of asks those more scientific philosophy of science questions, along with his musicology and his philosophy and his mathematics. Now, one of the main achievements of Archytas was to be much more subtly in tune with contemporary musical practices in his day. Philolaus tuning is very simplistic. Like, it might seem complex with all these numbers and all of that, but really all you're doing is tuning your ear to fourths and fifths, and they're very robust consonances that are easy to identify and easy to put down on strings. And if they're slightly out of tune, it doesn't really matter. It still sounds basically there. But the Pythagorean tuning is extremely limited harmonically. It only lets you play the fifth, the fourth, and the whole tone, that 9-8 ratio, the tone that's between the fourth and the fifth. All the other ratios become approximations, and very gross approximations at times. I have a very audible example of this at the bottom of the page where I talk about temperaments. The Pythagorean tuning makes the major thirds sound really out of whack, really vibrating like crazy. Listen to it here. And then you can hear that beat pattern going there, and this is with a sine wave generator, so it really isolates the tones. When you play it on a piano or something like that, it kind of gets masked by the overtones. They kind of like make it sound just a bit easier on the ear, but when you listen to it on a sine wave generator, the dissonance is very obvious. Now compare that to just intonation. There's no wobbling. It's very stable. That's because it's the pure ratio. It's those notes actually perfectly agreeing with each other as they move. In the Pythagorean, when we play those notes together, they are very dissonant. And so the Pythagorean tuning led a lot of ancient Greek musicians to not employ those intervals, to simply leave them out. And what Archytas does is much closer to what we would call ethno-musicology. He goes to the musicians, he sees what they're playing, he listens to the sounds, and he figures out how are they tuning it, what are the mathematics behind that tuning. It turns out the Greeks were using extremely harmonically rich tunings, way more complicated, way more subtle than this Philolaus tuning, this Pythagorean tuning that uses only fifths and fourths. Archytas's tunings use the major third that I was just playing you, and they also use this very strange sounding interval to us because we don't use it, but it's called the natural seventh, the septimal minor seventh also. We looked at that one in the last module, and it's the seventh harmonic in the harmonic series, and it has a beauty and simplicity to it. And if we look at this very complex diagram that kind of looks like an octagon that I have on the lesson, we see many intervals there: 8 to 7, 7 to 6, 6 to 5, 5 to 4. All of those ratios are impossible to play when you use the Pythagorean tuning. So Archytas uses his understanding of mathematics to greatly expand the tuning systems available. And again, this is not just some, mathematician totally like out of it and having no connection to what people were actually doing, what musicians were actually doing. Quite the opposite. He was deeply interested in what the mathematicians were doing and what the musicians were doing and how they were tuning their instruments and how they were using these justly tuned intervals, how these intervals locked together perfectly, unlike this spiraling system of Pythagorean tuning that gradually becomes more and more out of tune with itself.